chapter 6. And I have entitled this section, What Goes Around Comes Around. And you've probably heard that before. In this story with the book of Esther, we're at a point in the story that's pivotal for Esther, for the Jewish people, when it seems like things can't get any worse for God's people. Suddenly other things are still happening. You look at this story, and you look at this point where we're at in the story. There are five things that I want us to notice tonight as we go through chapter 6. There's 4 principles that we can apply, or 5, I keep saying 4, but there's actually 5, that we can apply to our life as Christians that we see here in the 6th chapter. And the very first one is, when all seems lost, it isn't. When all seems lost, it isn't. We need to trust the Lord. Here in chapter 6, we're at a point where we need to understand the storyline. The king, Ahasuerus, he's a Gentile. He does not care about the Jewish people. They're just another group of people that he has conquered, brought into his kingdom. They're just numbers on a roll book for him. He does not care about who they are. The king's closest confidant is a man named Haman, and Haman hates the Jews. Haman has a plan in place to totally eradicate every Jew in the Persian kingdom. The queen is Esther. Esther is a Jew, but nobody knows that Esther is a Jew other than Mordecai, who sits at the king's gate every day. Mordecai is her uncle, the one who adopted her, who is her guardian. And Haman, who hates all Jews, Haman, who has the plan in place to eradicate all the Jews, hates Mordecai so much, specifically hates Mordecai so much, that he has built gallows to be able to kill Mordecai. And when we talked last week, we talked about those gallows are not the same thing that you see in the Wild West Westerns, where they build this big contraption and it has a rope at the top, and you put the noose around their neck, and the person stands there and somebody on the ground pulls the lever and they... that's not what those gallows are. The gallows here would have been basically a post that was tens of feet tall that would have been sunk down in the ground, and they take the person and they basically just impale them over the top of it and leave them hanging there in public for everybody to be able to see them. That's what the gallows would have been in this story. They were making Haman was going to make a public spectacle out of Mordecai. He was going to show the whole world how much he really hated him by putting him up there. But if you study the history of gallows, the stake in the ground that they impaled people on top of, actually, hundreds of years later, that's where the Romans eventually got the idea of a cross. They would hang people on a wooden cross, only they nailed them there, suspended up in the air, and made a public spectacle out of them. So through the years, that gallows evolved as a way of torture and murder in the Roman government. So just some little history if you're interested in how people got killed in the Bible. That's you can follow that through. But here, Mordecai, when you look at Mordecai though, Haman's doing all of these things. The Jews are in peril. They're about to be eradicated. But what's Mordecai doing? Mordecai's sitting at the city gate like he does every other day. Mordecai's not having a pity party. Mordecai's not wringing his hands. Mordecai, in fact, is trusting the Lord. And here's the point. When all seems like it's lost, it isn't. And we're going to see that as we move through this story. And Mordecai knows that in the back of his mind. He knows the stories of how God has moved time and time again. And he believes that the God who delivered his people out of Egypt, he believes that the God who has delivered his people time and time again out of the hands of the Philistines and all the other groups that have come against God's people, he knows that same God is the God that he serves that's going to deliver them again. So even when it looks like all is lost, it's looked like that before for God's people. And he knew it wasn't all lost then. And that's where he's at right now, sitting at the city gate, waiting to see what God is going to do in midst of this situation. The second principle that I want you to realize and to notice that's here is when no one seems to notice what's going on in your life, actually somebody is noticing. Most of all, God notices what's happening in your life. You remember back in chapter 2, when Esther was first queen, Mordecai was sitting at the city gates again, where he sits all the time, and he heard two of the king's guards talking about an assassination plan. They were going to kill the king. Mordecai overheard that. He sent a message to Queen Esther. He said, "You've got to stop this." So Esther goes to the king and says, this man, Mordecai, at the gate, she didn't identify who he was as her uncle, but she said, the man Mordecai at the gate overheard, and these two men are going to assassinate you. And the assassination plot was stopped, and the king's life was saved. The two men, their names were Bigthan and Teresh, were killed before they could kill the king. But no one ever rewarded Mordecai for doing that. The king's life was saved, the two bad guys were killed, but nobody ever came to Mordecai and said, "Good job, buddy." They never gave him a reward. They never honored him publicly for that. It didn't seem like anybody even noticed that he had done that. But for Mordecai, he just did the right thing. And so he just went on with his life, doing what he did every single day, until we get to this point in the story, here in Esther, the 6th chapter. For several years, it looked like no one remembered. No one had noticed. No one cared that Mordecai had saved the king's life. But here in chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, it says, "During the night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, that they sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king had insomnia, and he wants someone to read the history books, read his diary to him. And you know what happens when you can't sleep at night? You just grab a book because you hope that it will put you to sleep. I wonder if that's what he was thinking. It's so boring in my kingdom. Maybe if they just read to me, that boring thing will put me to sleep. And as they were reading, he suddenly hears something that he had forgotten. You know how you'll be talking, like your family sitting around talking, and somebody will mention something that happened several years ago, and you say, "I forgot all about that." I think that's what happened to the king here. As they read the story, and he said, "Oh, I remember that. Now, what was that guy's name?" And they told him that it was Mordecai who had uncovered the plot and had reported it. And in the 3rd chapter, the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who were reading to him said, "Nothing has been done for him." All those years, nobody cared that Mordecai had saved the king's life. The king did not care that Mordecai had saved his life. And here in the darkness of the night, while the whole city was sleeping, while the king had insomnia, suddenly the sovereign hand of God is moving in this story. You know, we've talked about the sovereign hand of God, how he's in control of everything. At just the right time, at just the right moment, God is going to move, and he's going to take care of situations. The king did not have any idea that Haman had built gallows. The king did not know that Haman was going to kill Mordecai the next day. He had no idea that Haman was going to come in the early hours of the morning and say, "I've gotten rid of one of your worst enemies." And while Haman is sleeping, while Mordecai is sleeping, the king is not sleeping. And someone reads him a story, and he says, "I forgot all about that. We need to do something for this fine guy who saved my life all these years ago." And so I think it's important when we read that, just that little 3 words, "during the night." During the night, when it seems like nothing is going on, when it seems like nothing is happening, when it seems like nobody is noticing what's going on, God is noticing, and God is working behind the scenes. Hebrews, the 6th chapter, the 10th verse says, For God is not so unjust so as to forget your work and the love which you have shown toward his name, in having ministered and still ministering to the saints. Those 8 words. God is not so unjust as to forget. When no one else notices, God notices. He notices your sacrifice. He notices when you do the right thing. He notices when you do the hard things that nobody else wants to do. You know, I think we've all been there. When you look around, you're like, where's everybody else? Why am I the only one doing something? And nobody ever notices. God notices. God sees. God is aware of your sacrifice. He's aware of your heart to serve. He's aware of the good things that you're doing. And he will one day reward you for those things. In this story, Mordecai sees the reward in his lifetime. Some of us may not see the reward in our lifetime, but we know that we have a reward waiting for us when we get over into heaven. So when it looks like no one seems to notice, God notices. The third thing that I want you to see is that when everything seems great, it might not be. Haman thinks everything's going well. Haman thinks everything is working out exactly the way he wanted it to work out. Haman is full of himself. And we all know people who are like that. They are so full of themselves, they can't see anybody else. All they see is themselves everywhere they're at. Everything is about them all the time. And here in this early morning hours of the story, Haman, who's so sure that he is the king's favorite, comes running into the palace. And in verses 4 and 5, the king, who's still in bed after hearing the story, and he knows he needs to reward Mordecai for saving his life, he tells the people who are taking care of him, his servants who are there, he says, who's out there in the court? I need you to go get whoever is standing out there and bring them in here so that I can make sure that Mordecai gets rewarded for what he has done. And in verses 4 and 5 it says, so the king said, who's in the court? And Haman just happened to be the man who was in the court. Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said to him, well, Haman is standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. Here is an awesome moment in the story, because the king has one plan, but Haman thinks he has another plan. And out of the inner court, Haman hears the king say, bring Haman in. And Haman his head probably swelled 10 sizes when he heard the king calling for him. And he probably thought, this is my chance. This is my opportunity. In just a minute, I'm going to tell the king we're going to be done with Mordecai, and I am going to be the king's right-hand man, and I'm not going to have anybody else to ever give me any trouble in this kingdom again. But before he could ever talk to the king, in verse 6 it says, so Haman came in, and the king said to him, what is to be done for the man who the king desires to honor? And Haman, who's so full of himself, thought, now whom would the king desire to honor other than me? Because I'm the greatest that the king has. I'm the best man in this kingdom. I know the king wants to honor me. Haman is the guy that every time he walks into a room, he's going to tell you how much money he makes every day. He's going to tell you how many cars he owns. He's going to tell you how great he is and why you should be his best friend and what he can do for you if you will follow after him. We know those kinds of people. That's who Haman is here in this story. And Haman says, well, if the king wants to honor me, I'm going to tell him how to do it and how to do it right. And in verses 7 through 9, Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" And the king says, "That's a great idea. That's pretty awesome. I would have never thought to do that." And then in verse number 10, the king said to Haman, "Take quickly the robes and the horse, just like you said, and go find Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. And don't leave out one part of anything that you said needed to be done." I can't even imagine what Haman must have been thinking at that moment. He probably felt like someone had just gut punched him. He probably couldn't breathe. He probably was like, "I cannot believe that this is happening to me right here, right now." He had to have been humiliated. He had to have, at that point, thought, if there was any way I could get out of this, I would. But he could not, because the king had commanded that he do that. So in verse number 11, it says, "So Haman took the robe and the horse, and he put Mordecai on the horse, and he arrayed the king's robes on him, and he led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" Mordecai returned to the king's gate after he had his horse ride around town, after Haman proclaimed he was the most wonderful man that the king had ever met. It says that Mordecai just went right back to the city gates and sat down. If Haman had been the one on the horse, if Haman had been the one wearing the king's robe and being led through the city, he probably would have had to take a couple of victory laps around. He probably would have had to have the t-shirt that said, "I'm the man." But not Mordecai. Mordecai rode the horse. Mordecai wore the robes. But what did Mordecai do? He went right back to where he'd always been before. He was the same man he was before. Mordecai was humble. He knew his place. He knew that he had a purpose and he had a mission. And climbing the political ladder was not the mission that was in his life. His role did not go to his head. He was very different from Haman. And so the fourth thing here is, well, that last part, though, I just want to remind you again that when everything seems great, it might not be. So kind of watch that in your life. Because we could be having a Haman moment when we think everything's great, but God's about to deflate us. And that's what he was doing there to Haman. But the fourth thing I want you to see is that when nothing seems just, it really is. Because our God is a God of justice. Haman is going to get what Haman deserves. I put a quote there on your paper. Actually, I'll read that in a minute. I'm not going to read that just now. But Haman gets everything he deserves. In verses 12 through 13, it says, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried home. It even says that he took his robe and covered his face up, covered his head up so nobody could even see him as he was walking down the street. He was so embarrassed. He was so humiliated. And Haman went home and he told his wife and he told his friends everything that had happened to him. The last time he went home, it was after the first banquet with Esther and the king. You remember he went in and he was bragging. He was hanging the peacock strutting about all that was going on. But now he comes in with his face covered and he's so humiliated. And Haman, instead of saying, I might have been wrong, and Haman, instead of saying, I think I'm being taught a valuable lesson here, no, Haman comes in and he begins to blame everybody else for what's going on. He begins to blame Mordecai. He begins to blame everybody else instead of saying, Maybe I messed up. Maybe I shouldn't have done what I did. But then when you have the heart of Haman, when you have the mentality of Haman, it's always everybody else's fault. You're always the best, and everybody else is the ones who are messing up. But the scripture says, in verse number 13, Haman's wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him. They really prophesied to Haman there and said, you're probably about to get what you deserve. You probably have made the wrong decision. God had not turned a blind eye to Haman's plans. God had not forgotten Haman's attitude toward Mordecai. He had not let it slip that Haman wanted to kill all of the Jewish people. He had not forgotten his people that he had made promises to all throughout the years. And in the 14th verse of the 6th chapter, it says that while Haman's friends and while his wife were talking to him and prophesying to him there, the king's eunuchs arrived, knocked on the door, and hastily brought Haman to the second banquet that the queen had prepared. I wonder, as they took Haman out of the house, if he had to walk by those gallows that he had built. I wonder what he was thinking as he was looking at those. I wonder if he was thinking, I can't wait to get Mordecai up there. Or if he was thinking, I wish I'd never seen those things. I wish I had never started this. I wonder what he was thinking as he went to that second banquet. But one thing is for sure. When everything seems unjust, God is a God of justice. And he's about to make all things right. And that brings us to the last principle that I think we see here in the story of Esther that's starting to unfold, is that when God seems absent, and in this story, is the name of God absent? Not mentioned one time in this book. Never is God's name mentioned. Doesn't even say that they pray to God. It says they fast. But it doesn't say that they pray to God. It's as if God is not there in this story. But when God seems absent, he's present. God, who is invisible, is working. God that you can't see sometimes. God that you can't feel sometimes. God who seems like he's working for everybody else and has left you behind. He is there, and he is working. And that's the quote that I wanted to read to you. Even when you think you have lost all, God uses it as an opportunity to awaken you to the realization he is still in charge, as well as to bring you to your knees in worship of him. And I don't know about you, but in my life there have been times when I've thought, where are you, God? Why is that? And all these things are happening, and it seems like everybody else has got it easy. And why am I going through this? Why is it that these things are happening? And you are so far away. Do you even care? But even in those moments when I look back and I realize, there was God. There was God. There was God all along. He was working. And that's what we see here in the story of Esther. Probably Esther and Mordecai, even in the middle of that story, as all of these things kept progressing, it was probably hard for them to see God at work in that. Probably hard for them to look and see what good could come out of that whole situation. But at the same time, they had no one else to turn to other than God. And that's the way it is in our life. Even in those moments when you say, where are you, God? You're crying out to him because you know there's no one else that you can turn to. And so you're saying, even though I don't see you, even though I don't feel you, even though I don't understand, I'm still reaching out to you because you're my only hope. And God is always there. He's always working. And so this story of Esther, we see the hand of God moving, the powerful hand of God, who's orchestrating something that's bigger than Mordecai, bigger than Esther, something that is more powerful than any evil plot that Haman can come up with. God is saying to us today, I'm here. I'm working. I love you. I'm for you. I am not against you. And all the evil in this world that can come against you is not greater than the God that we serve. And so these principles that we've talked about tonight, yeah, we can pull those out of the story of Esther, but we can really bring them into the year 2023, and we can apply them to our lives. This, when it all seems lost, it isn't, because we need to trust in the Lord. When no one seems to notice, God notices. When everything seems great, be careful, because it might not be. When nothing seems just, it really is, because we serve a God of justice. And when God seems absent, He really is present. He really is there. You guys have any questions, any comments, any thoughts about this 6th chapter of Esther tonight?